Some of you might remember me from 2 years ago when I first spoke at this conference. At that point, my husband and 2 girls and I were fresh on the heels of his forced resignation from our church in Ontario, where he'd been pastoring and we'd been serving together for 12 years. Not surprisingly, I spoke at that time on how to handle church hurt with love. And now here I am 2 years later, a bit more healed, a bit more humble, and hopefully a bit wiser. Maybe the next 20 minutes or so will prove or disprove that. A lot has happened in the last 2 years for our family. In April, after a long wait for U.S. immigration to finalize my husband's permanent residency, we finally moved to Wauseon, Ohio, for Mark to serve as pastor of Everyday Hope Church. Wauseon is a small town of about 7,000 people in northwest Ohio. The town of trains and one of the best hospitals in the area, it also happens to be about 25 miles from the area where I grew up in southeast Michigan. Coming back home has had its joys and challenges. People say that missionaries never really come home because they don't seem to fit anywhere, and sometimes I have felt that way since returning to the area where I was raised nearly 30 years ago. I think that's part of the reason that all the things that were different than they used to be were harder to adjust to. One logistical thing in particular kind of threw me upon our arrival in Ohio. After the first day or so, we began making phone call after phone call and email after email, setting up electricity and gas, phone for our new place of residence. The piles of logistical things always stack up when you move anywhere, as we well know as pastors' wives. But when you move from country to country, the stack doubles or triples. One such requirement was, of course, getting a new driver's license. Now, any other time we'd moved, even back and forth between the US and Canada over the years, we just turned in our current license and traded for the one for the new state or province. Not so in Ohio. When I called the local office, the lady informed me that since I was coming from out of country, I would need to write a written and in-car driver's test to receive my license. I still remember my response to the lady on the phone. Hopefully it was said with some kindness, though certainly with incredulity as well. You mean that even though I've been driving since I was 16, I still have to do an in-car test? After taking a deep breath, well, she patiently said, "Yes, ma'am." I attempted a kind reply in return, thanked her, and hung up the phone. Then I decided I'd have to deal with it later. I was too overwhelmed to even think about one more detail to settle. At this point, you might be detecting that the stress of an international move, plus the pileup of waiting for nearly 2 years for immigration to process while we still lived in the same area where he'd been forced to resign, might be catching up with me. You'd be right. It had. The next weeks and months were extremely busy, but we were so grateful to be moving on after our painful experiences and to be living in a new place with a fresh start that the stresses were worth it. However, I don't think I realized how much it had all caught up with me or how I was still healing from all that we'd experienced until a day about a month or so after moving that I finally scheduled my driver's test. I'd already passed the written one after studying with those online quizzes for a few days, so that was checked off. And I'd finally managed to get the driver's test actually scheduled, despite the fact that with all the transitions and changes, it was hard for me to even get into the system to sign up. I was ready, or so I thought. Until the day of the test and my lunch break, when I looked at the videos for how to do the maneuverability test, which was part of the driving test. Basically, it takes the place of the parallel parking part of the exam and requires the driver to drive forward, turn, and back up between cones set up barely the length of a car. The width of a small car, that is. Yeah, so I watched these videos, and I had the thought, I should probably practice this before I go. I especially thought this because of the fact that our car wasn't worth importing to the US, and we only had our Jeep to drive, which is not nearly as small as a car. But I ignored the concern and thought I just need to get this done. So I plunged ahead and went to my test at 4 p.m. that afternoon with some nerves vibrating, but with determination to plow ahead. Bless the older man who kindly tried to ease my tension as I drove in and out of the cones in our Jeep, botching it so badly that I failed the exam. He allowed me to carry on and take my road driving test, which I passed just fine. After all, I was only driving forward for that. But he gave me the bad news at the end that because I was over 18 and had failed the test, I'd have to take 8 hours of driving lessons, 4 in the classroom and 4 in the car, before I could attempt the exam again. Outwardly, I calmly accepted the red and black postcard with the bright words, "Are you over 18?" and patiently listened to his explanations of all my options for yet another hoop I was going to have to jump through to try to settle in this new place. Inwardly, however, the tension was so high in my body that I knew I'd better get home soon before I broke down entirely. Home wasn't far, after all, our town is small, and as soon as I got in the door, my family eagerly met me and asked how it went. I sputtered and I spit about the evils of the system and the stupid test, then proceeded to lay down in my bed and cry. There I stayed for the rest of the evening for the most part. I tried to get up to eat, but only managed to move to the couch, where I curled up in a ball and slept for a while, nursing my wounds inflicted by pride and so much more. Even in the weight of my depression and stress that night, I knew that this was not really about failing a driver's test, though it surely was going to complicate our already complicated transition. But it was more of a trigger that was reminding me that I was still not healed from all we'd been through. Some of the wounds I was nursing weren't just from my bruised pride at failing at something I thought I could do without practice or help, but from wounds inflicted where there was no fault, from which I was still struggling to heal. In the years following us having to leave our church, I've been continually wrestling with wearing the shame imposed on us by those who forced my husband to resign and left us feeling we were abandoned and failures in ministry. This driving test failure set off in my body, head, and spirit another challenge to rise up out of the lies that we'd lived under for so long that it was our fault and that we'd failed in ministry. That oppression under which we lived before we even recognized it as such was a prolonged trauma that's going to require just as much time, if not more, to heal. And in fact, we will always bear the scars to some degree. The beauty of that is, though, that Christ still bears his scars too, as a reminder of his sacrifice and his choice to humble himself for our sake. He was oppressed and abused and mistreated more than any other human being ever has been or will be, and God used all of that for his purposes. He will work his purpose through my suffering too. When living in an abusive or oppressive situation, we can learn humility and trust in the face of fear through the power of God's tender and good heart towards us. Let me say that again. When living in an abusive or oppressive situation, we can learn humility and trust in the face of fear through the power of God's tender and good heart towards us. Let me unpack this a bit by examining some insights that God gave me through the life of Gideon, which I studied while working through the book of Judges over the last few months. I have a very clear memory of a book that was on our shelf as children, along with many other Bible story type books, which retold the story of Gideon from the book of Judges. My memories of him as a kid weren't very favorable. I mean, how many kids in Sunday school ever chose Gideon as their favorite Bible hero? He's not really known for his stellar character or faith. In fact, I recall being taught that I shouldn't be like Gideon. He didn't have faith. He tested God instead of trusting him, etc. But when I studied Gideon's life recently, I saw him in a whole new light. And I think he might just be my new favorite Bible character. I surely need to learn the lessons that he learned, and I can see myself in him in ways I never have before, as God has humbled me through my experiences in the last few years. I grew up steeped like tea in the American evangelical culture. Not a bad thing, as it gave me a passion for Christ and for missions. This passion eventually catapulted me out of my farming communities, surrounded by aunts, uncles, and cousins who also loved Jesus, and into the multicultural concrete jungle of Chicago, and eventually other cities and towns in both the US and Canada. The longer my husband and I were in ministry, the more I realized how unglamorous serving Jesus really is. My vision of reaching the world, even though the world and mission field God put in my heart was the many small towns and rural areas of North America, it was still very rosy-colored and idealistic. Of course, there's nothing wrong with that, but along with my mindset of changing the world for Christ came a healthy dose of pride in my own leadership abilities. There's no question that God gave me the abilities and gifts I was using to serve him, but until ministry became hard, it didn't take long, only about 2 or 3 years into my husband pastoring our first church, I didn't realize how weak and untested my faith really was. One of the things I learned, like Gideon, is that it's okay to admit that you are afraid. When we first meet Gideon, he's beating out wheat in his wine press so that he can hide it from the Midianites. These people were your classic abusers. They'd so oppressed the Israelites that people were hiding in caves from them. They would bully themselves into the land with all their livestock and tents and camels, set up camp and take over. They'd ravage their fields, pillage and steal, so there was nothing left for the people of God. Gideon and his fellow Israelites had been living so long under the oppression of the Midianites that they didn't even know how to live without being afraid. It had been happening so long that they probably wondered if they deserved it. In this case, to a certain degree they did, as it was God's judgment on them for abandoning him. But this is not, of course, the case with most abuse. However, the result of living in this environment is the same. The Israelites and Gideon subsequently lived in constant defeat, just accepting the abuse and hiding, living in fear all the time. And yet, when the angel of the Lord appears to Gideon, he says, "The Lord is with you, O valiant warrior." What? Valiant warrior? He's hiding in a wine press, for crying out loud. Where is the courage and will to fight in that? And yet, the Lord sees not who Gideon is or appears to be at the moment, but who he will become. Laying down on that couch, paralyzed by defeat and fear just a few short months ago, was not the only time I was in that position. So many times after our painful experiences, I would find myself depressed and unable to go the next step. Even after God had graciously led us to Everyday Hope Church, a church for the broken, I was still afraid. This was where we felt God's leading and direction clear. These were people who knew what it meant to need Christ personally and who wanted to serve with us to reach out to our new community, once the U.S. government would finally let my husband into the country. But still, I feared. The process of immigration to the U.S. has many steps, and as the time dragged on, we felt like we'd never make it to Ohio to serve the Lord there where he had next called us. I was afraid. My husband had no income for 2 years. Even his unemployment payments got delayed for over a year due to his honesty in reporting that he'd left the country for short visits to look for work. My salary just barely covered our living expenses, and people from our old church kept contacting us, sometimes even just showing up at our door trying to help, which only dredged up the pain and fear even more. Then, when we did visit our new church in Ohio for the weekend, I'd feel loved and weepy and hopeful and guarded all at the same time. What if these people turn on us too? No one is really actually this kind and loving, are they? Valiant warrior Wendy, indeed. And yet, God calls me the same, even in my fears, even in my healing from prolonged trauma and abuse of others. It's okay to admit that I'm afraid. Gideon did. He took his questions to God. He asked, "If you're with us, why has all this happened to us? Why have you abandoned us to our enemies?" That's Judges 6:13. Like Gideon, not only did I learn that it's okay to be afraid, I also learned that in my despair, it's okay to ask God for signs of his presence. He will give them to me. He's that gracious. He's that tender. He's that good. Always. At so many points in our journey in the last few years, God has shown up just when I needed it, to be assured that he wouldn't abandon us and that he would give us a place to serve him again. At first, my husband contemplated not even returning to pastoral ministry. That was hard for both of us, as it was the calling we knew he'd placed on us before we were married. But now we were just wondering if it was time to move on to something else. But what else could we do? Preaching and pastoring was my husband's livelihood and his passion and calling, and though he had a few interviews and good leads, nothing came to anything, until God led us to Everyday Hope. God opened that door, and the church voted unanimously for him to come as their pastor. But then the wait began, as we jumped through one government hoop after another. And so many times we doubted and needed to know that he was with us. As we saw the bank account diminish, God would provide through cashing in an old insurance policy or a gift from someone. Like Gideon, we'd put out our fleece, and it'd be wet or dry, and we'd know that he really was with us as he promised. We knew that we'd defeat these oppressive enemies of fear and doubt and lies, that we weren't fit anymore for ministry. Every one of us is familiar with the fleeces, but did you know that Gideon asked for more signs than that? The first time was when the angel of the Lord appeared to him at the winepress and declared that he would defeat Midian as one man, even though his family was the least and he was the youngest in his clan. Gideon begged the man to show him a sign that he was really God who was speaking to him, and the Lord agreed. Then when Gideon brought back the offering and the angel instructed him how to lay it on the altar, fire sprang up and consumed it. And then the angel vanished from his sight. But only from his sight, because while Gideon stood quaking in his sandals yet again, the Lord said to him, "Peace to you, do not fear, you shall not die." Then Gideon built an altar and called it, "The Lord is Peace." Isn't that beautiful? Not only did the Lord call Gideon not who he was, but who he'd become, he assured him of his presence and calmed his fears with peace. It didn't stop there, though. Later we know that when Gideon put out the fleece not once but twice, God answered him both times later without judgment. And then before Gideon even asked when he was ready with the army God had reduced to 300 men to defeat his enemy, God gave him a sign. The night before the battle, the Lord said to him, "Arise, go down against the camp, for I have given it into your hands. But if you are afraid to go down," which we know he was, the Lord said, "Go with Purah your servant down to the camp, and you will hear what they say. And afterward your hands will be strengthened, that you may go down against the camp." That's Judges 7, 9-11. When he got there, Gideon overheard a Midianite talking about a dream he had had of a large barley loaf crashing into the camp and lying all of the Midianite camp flat. He told his fellow soldier, "This is nothing less than the sword of Gideon. God has given Midian and all the camp into his hand." God assured Gideon of victory through his enemies, no less. Isn't that just like God? To tenderly give us assurances of his presence and victory, even through the very ones of whom we're afraid. It's okay to be afraid. It's okay to ask for signs of his presence. And it's okay to still be afraid, even as you obey. Gideon was afraid too, but he obeyed. The same night that the angel of the Lord first appeared to him, he told Gideon to go down to his father's altar and tear down the Baal and the Asherah pole, and instead build a altar to the Lord in its place. What a test! Who would want to have that conflict with your parents? Now, obviously, Gideon was afraid to take that down and incur his father's displeasure and possibly his wrath. So he took 10 servants and he did the deed in the cover of darkness. Judges 6:25-27. Now, again, we could criticize him for not having the guts to do it in the daytime, but he did still do it. And God honored him by raising up his own father to defend him when the townspeople wanted to kill him for what he'd done. We see his obedience shine through again when God reduced his army down to 300 men, though the Midianites outnumbered them greatly. He must have been asking God what in the world he was doing, taking his force down to such a small army when he had such a large army to fight. But we've already seen how God clearly revealed to Gideon that God would give the victory. The trumpets blew, the pitchers were smashed to reveal the light all around the camp, and the Midianites were so afraid that they began to turn on each other, and they fled, so the Israelite army was able to pursue and defeat them. Many times throughout the last few years, as I've been quaking in my tennis shoes, afraid to obey, afraid of who might criticize us next, afraid that they might just force us out and we'd be without a job or a home or a place to go, which they did, of course, I wondered, where's the victory in this? I wasn't afraid to obey. I told God about it. I wasn't afraid to ask God for signs of his presence. He had given them. And I obeyed him in the midst of my fears. So where was the victory? We didn't see God rout our enemies. They forced us out. And they did what they wanted to do. They still are, as far as I know. It seems like they won. What's up with that, God? So I've started to ask a different question. What defines victory? Victory isn't necessarily seeing my enemies routed and our choices vindicated. Surely that will come in God's perfectly just and merciful time and way. But for now, victory is acknowledging my own weakness and dependence on him. It's in learning to humble myself before him, no matter my circumstances, to accept his will for me and trust in his good and tender heart towards me. I love how Elizabeth Elliot encapsulates this principle in one of the many wise things she wrote about suffering. It is in our acceptance of what is given that God gives himself. Even the Son of God had to learn obedience by the things he suffered, she says, and his reward was desolation, crucifixion. God gives himself. That is where the victory lies for me. It means humbling myself and learning how to drive again. Through my experiences, I will know God himself, and that's going to require some humbling on my part. I'm glad that he's willing to do that for me. Take encouragement, sisters, from my story, and from the story of old, the oldest in the Old Testament, besides the story of the beginning, the story of Job. John Piper has put out an excellent book called The Misery of Job and the Mercy of God, which is a poetic rendering of the book of Job. In it, he poignantly concludes with this summary of Job's suffering and God's response. And I quote here, "Behold the mercy of our King, who takes from death its bitter sting, and by his blood, and often ours, brings triumph out of hostile powers, and paints with crimson earth and soul, until the bloody work is whole. What we have lost, God will restore, that and himself forevermore. When he is finished with his art, the quiet worship of our heart. When God creates a humble hush and makes Leviathan his brush, it won't be long before the rod becomes the tender kiss of God." Precious sisters, no church trauma, no abuse, no trial, no suffering will ever remove the tender kiss of God from you. In humbling us, he is able, if we are willing, to gain the quiet worship of our hearts. That is where we really have the peace and joy we've been craving all along. That's where victory will come too, in facing our fears, in fighting the lies that we deserve what we've experienced or that we're failures and God can never use us again. The truth will set us free, and it might even help me to pass my driving test. I know I'm still practicing driving forward and backward through those cones, and I'm still afraid, but I'm learning to be willing to be weak, like Gideon, and keep seeking to trust God and his strength for the victory. If I can do that, it's a guaranteed pass, whether I get a driver's license or not. As was mentioned previously, I am the director of Flowers for the Pastor's Wife. We exist to encourage, equip, and connect pastor's wife who are serving in small towns and rural areas throughout the US and Canada and the world. We encourage others through our articles, our publications, and social media. You can check out our website at flowersforthepastorswife.com. And please sign up there. We have a blog that you can register for blogs that are private just for pastors' wives. We also have public blogs that are out there to be enjoyed by anyone who would like to read them. We also have a book that we have published, Love, Joy, and Faithfulness, a 90-day devotional for the pastor's wife. And we hope to publish a new one this coming fall, Hope, Patience, Prayer, a 100-day devotional for the pastor's wife. So watch for that. Check out our Facebook, community Facebook group, Flowers for the Pastor's Wife, and our public Facebook page, Instagram as well. And we're actually hoping to start some podcasts soon. So check out Flowers for the Pastor's Wife under our Spotify account, and you will see some things coming up there as well. So thanks again for listening today, and hopefully we'll see you in the Flowers Facebook community.